Today, you are going to do a little bit of exploring with reflections and see if you can play with some reflections a little bit and start getting some information about how some basic reflections work on a graph. What I want to do is start this activity with you so that you have some ideas on how this activity works to help your work turn out accurately so that you can make some good observations. So I have printed a copy of today's reflection activity. I realize that some of you print your work, some of you like to work electronically. This is not a great one to try to freehand draw on a piece of notebook paper if you're somebody that normally uses notebook paper, because you would have to completely redraw this graph in order to do this activity. So if that's you, then you might want to use the graph on your computer screen. So if you're working electronically, you can still do the same things that I'm about to show you, and I'll talk to you about how you can do it on paper versus how you can adapt it to work if you're working electronically. In order to do today's activity, you are going to need to round up some supplies. So you are going to need either a piece of wax paper. So I literally went into my kitchen and I raided a little piece of wax paper out of the kitchen. So a lot of you guys probably have wax paper in your kitchen at home. If you do, then pause the video and go grab a little piece of wax paper really quickly. So you can see like my wax paper is a little bit smaller than my actual paper. So you don't need a huge sheet. Parchment paper also works. So if you have a family that likes to bake, parchment paper is just wax paper without the wax coating. So if you have that in your kitchen, if you can't find like wax paper or parchment paper in your kitchen, then a thin sheet of paper will also do the job for this activity. So what you need, and why I'm suggesting wax paper, is because it's see-through. So you're going to need something that you can set down over the top of your graph and be able to see through the paper onto the graph. So you're going to need that. The activity also suggests some color coding. So it suggests, because you're going to end up with 4 different shapes on this graph when you're done. You're going to have your pre-image and then 4 different images from reflecting your pre-image around on the graph. So the activity suggests using a different color for each one of these. So it suggests to do black marker for the original shape, which I did. And then you can kind of see, if you look down here, it suggests, use a red marker, use a blue marker, use a yellow marker. So you don't have to color code this. You do need to make sure that you're using correct notation to label your figures, which I'll show you in just a minute. I think the color coding helps, though, just to make it easier to be able to look at quick glance at the shapes, because you are going to end up with 4 different shapes on here. So if they're different colors, it just makes it a little easier to sort out which one's which so you don't get confused. You can use markers. You can also use colored pencils. I actually have colored pencils. So you don't have to color code, but if you're somebody that wants to color code it to be able to tell things apart, then you might want to grab those things. So if you need to, this would be a good place to pause the video and go and round up the things that you need, especially your wax paper or your see-through paper. And then when you're ready, you can come back and we will actually start this activity together. So at this point, you should have your supplies. I am going to show you how to actually use this to reflect a shape. So this first shape, it says using a red marker. So I'm going to use a red colored pencil. You don't have to color code if you don't want to, but it can be helpful just to tell shapes apart. So it says we're trying to find angle B prime, A prime, T prime. Remember, we said that notation is called prime notation. And how we're going to get that is by reflecting across the X axis. So how you can use your see-through paper to reflect. What you need to do is you need to put your paper down over your graph. So either on your paper like mine, or if you're working electronically, you can hold your paper up against your computer screen and you should be able to see through the paper the shape, because your computer screen glows, so it will actually illuminate the shape through your paper. So you can very gently hold it up to your computer screen and trace it, or hold it down and trace it on your paper. But what you need to do is, oops, not drop this. So you're going to put your paper down and we're going to start by tracing our original shape. So I'm just going right over the top of my original shape, and I'm kind of pressing pretty hard. If you're using wax paper, remember wax paper does have a wax coating. So use a pencil or an ink pen if you use a marker, it'll rub right off the wax and get really messy. So if you're using something like wax paper with a wax coating, use a pencil or a pen, and you're going to want to press hard enough. So you can see I'm pressing pretty hard so you can see the triangle on there. So I'm going to put it back over the top. The other thing that you also want to do, so we're going to be doing some reflecting over the X and the Y axis. So what you can do is go ahead and trace your X axis and your Y axis. So if you move the paper, you can see I now have what looks like a duplicate copy of my graph. There's my X axis, there's my Y axis, there's my shape. So now that I have this all mapped out, if I put this back, I can use this to do some reflecting with my shape. So the first one says use a red marker, or you don't have to, but you can if you want. Plot the triangle, which is a reflection across the X axis. So this is the X axis. So that means we are flipping it over the X axis. So whatever you're reflecting across is basically what you're flipping it over. So I'm going to take it and I'm going to flip it. So remember, reflection is a flip. So I'm going to flip it over and it's going to go like this. So if you think of it kind of flipping that way. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to literally take our paper and flip it over to see where our shape lands. But before we do that, I want to point out to you, you want to be careful with matching things up. So when we flip our shape over, you want to make sure that you're just flipping the shape and not accidentally translating. Remember, a translation is a slide. Not accidentally translating the shape at the same time. So we don't want a reflection combined with a translation. We just want a reflection. So the way that you can make sure that you are reflecting without sliding the shape is this. So I'm going to take my paper, I'm going to pick it up, and since I'm flipping over the X axis, I'm going to flip this way. So I'm going to literally turn my paper over. So it has now been flipped over the X axis, and if I set it back down, the way I can make sure my shape isn't translated is that my X axis and my Y axis should line back up. So I can see where my shape lands. So what I can do now is I can very carefully grab those coordinates and I can write them down here. So we have to pay attention to what landed where. So B landed here, A landed here, T landed there. So we'll get all that labeled in just a minute. But first, let's take a minute and just very carefully write that down. So B ended up right, my paper shifted a little bit. B ended up right here. So that coordinate is 2, -3. So the new coordinates of B or B prime are 2, -3. A landed right here. So that's 5, -2. So 5, -2. And then T landed right here. So that coordinate is 4, -6. So once you have the coordinates written down, because it says to draw this on the graph, so you can't really draw it on the graph with your wax paper or your tracing paper sitting there. So once you've got this and you're kind of holding it there and you've written down the coordinates, then you can move this out of the way. And now you've got your coordinates written down so you can actually draw your final shape. So I'm going to take my red colored pencil and I'm going to mark the points and I'm going to label them correctly. So B prime is 2, -3. So it landed right there. So that's B prime. And then A landed at 5, -2. So that's right there. So that's A prime. So notice I'm using my prime notation so I could tell the original A apart from the new A. And then T landed at 4, -6. So 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is going to be right there is T prime. And there is my first reflected triangle. This last part I'm going to leave for you. So it asks you, how do the coordinates of the original of the new shape compare to the original triangle? So you're going to look at these coordinates and these coordinates, and you might already be noticing some things about how they compare. But if you look at these numbers and these numbers, I want you to write down what you notice in this space down here. And then you are going to keep going with this activity. So you're going to do the same thing, but the next shape, instead of reflecting it over the x-axis, so flipping it over the x-axis, you're going to reflect it over the y-axis. So now you're going to flip it this way. and you're going to repeat the process. See where it lands. Make sure you line your axes back up so that you're not sliding your shape. Write down the coordinates, move your paper, draw the shape. Tell me what you notice about the coordinates. Now, before I let you loose to finish this and try this, now that we've kind of started it together, I want to talk to you about the last one on here. So this last one, reflection across the line, y equals x. I want to talk about where that line is for just a minute, because you're going to have to add that onto your graph and add it onto your tracing paper in order to flip over that line. So remember, this is a slope-intercept equation. Y equals x is actually y equals 1x plus 0. So that means I start with a y-intercept of 0, and my slope is 1. So I would go up 1 and over 1. So where that graph is going to end up being, if I graph that, so y-intercept of 0, up 1 and over 1, it's going to put me right there, up 1 over 1 again. So what I'm going to end up with is this perfectly diagonal line that's going to be running. And I would recommend, I'm actually being kind of naughty, I would recommend using a straight edge to draw your line, because if your line's not perfectly straight, then it will throw off your reflection. I'm just being super, super careful. So that is the line that you're reflecting over. So when you take your shape, you're going to take wherever your shape is and you're going to flip it over that line. So when you go to do that one, you got your original shape. If you put your paper down, that means that when you go to do this flip, you're going to need to add that line onto your tracing paper. So see, now I've got that line on there. So I could take this and I can flip it over that line. So if I flip it over the line, I'm going to flip my paper over and I'm going to line it back up, and make sure you line up your X and Y axis so that you're not translating the shape. So this one, because it's kind of in the middle here, so one side of it's on one side of the line, one side of it's on the other side of the line, it is going to flip the shape on top of itself. So if your shape is off over here, you did it wrong. Okay. So at this point, I am going to let you loose to finish off the last little bit of the first part. So write down your observations and you're going to try the second 2 reflections. Again, if you're working electronically, then you can just hold your paper up really carefully to your computer screen and do your reflection and just kind of look and see where it is, and then use, Cami or your stylus, whatever you're using, to write down your coordinates, and then you can plot it electronically on your computer screen. So it doesn't really matter if you're working on paper, if you're working electronically, you can still take your tracing paper and either put it down on your paper or hold it up to your computer screen to do your reflections. So there you go. That is how this activity works. So when you're ready, you can go ahead and finish it.